Hi friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. This is Story Time. It is Saturday, so we are doing Story Saturday today, reading one of the stories that I wrote, so you can enjoy it and then come back for more. But first, we're going to have a word from our sponsor being me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. As you guys are watching this, I am out of town. I'm off in Tennessee doing the LibertyCon thing, meeting other science fiction and fantasy people who like that stuff and doing writerly things and meeting folks and networking and having a good old time. And you guys can have a good old time here on the channel as well, because we are going to read another story. This story is from last year's project, the final story in the first volume from last year. It is called Dream of the Dryad. It is a fantasy/horror story, and you will like it, because I wrote it, and I'm reading it, and it's fun. So let's get to it without any further ado. Enjoy. Steady raindrops made a drumbeat atop the raised cowl of Norman's cloak as he trudged up the path toward his home in the foothills above his lord's manor house and the village adjacent to it, where most of the yeoman farmers who worked the fields surrounding the manor lived. Many times he had been asked why he didn't live nearby to the others, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of envy, sometimes out of suspicion that he must be out of his mind. Most times he pointed out that it made no sense for a trapper and tanner to live close in. For one thing, the agents he used to tan the hides of the animals he caught were pungent. For another thing, being in the woods meant it was easier to set and tend to his traps. Folks generally nodded and let it drop, understanding if not generally agreeing with his reasoning. But really, Norman just didn't like being around people all the time, and he loved the beauty of the wooded hills, the seclusion of it. Just him, his dog, his work, and God's nature to fill his soul with peace. Would be nice to have a woman around sometimes, though. He had to admit that. But despite how truly he did love being up here, right then, as his boots sank deeply into mud that used to be a well-packed path leading up to his home, and wind-driven rain splattered his face and dripped down inside his cloak to soak the rest of him, and the darkening evening's chill seemed to creep into his very bones, he reflected that maybe those naysayers had the right of it after all. But that idea wouldn't do him any good right this moment, and besides, he knew it was a lie even as he thought it. So he kept his head down, looking toward the next few steps ahead, and trying to ignore the increasing dark that imposed upon the dreary gray overhead as the sun slipped beneath the horizon to the west, and placed one foot in front of the other. Just a few hundred more yards, then he would reach the top of the shallow rise he was climbing. Then a turn to the right, and he'd get to his cabin, built from logs that his father had helped his grandfather fell, hew, and stack to create the dwelling that had passed on to him. Just a little while longer, then he could pull out the coals he had stashed away into a warming dish beside his stove, shove them within, and feed some kindling and tinder, blow on them to produce a flame, and then feed it with the larger fuel he had stacked in the corner as the retarded but not smothered flame renewed itself. And then blessed, glorious warmth. Not long now. The rain seemed to increase with the encroaching gloom, and the oaks and elms lining the track up to his home began to take on sinister shapes all around him. The smell of water in the air seemed to become sour, rank, like some poison had leached into the rainfall itself. Foolishness. Norman shook himself, sending his own shower of droplets that fell in tandem with the rain, as his cloak shed for a heartbeat the burden nature had imparted upon it. But only for a second. Then the impact of the drops upon his head was all, and the gloom continued to deepen. Overhead, the clouds seemed to lower, their gray wanting to swallow up what little remaining light there was, and he heard the rumbling of thunder off in the distance. Then closer, and flashing of lightning began to illuminate the track ahead and the trees on either side in fleeting but brilliant white-blue instants that made him blink from the sudden contrast with the dark of the approaching night. He should never have stayed at the harvest feast as long as he had. He knew how long it would take to get home, and the building clouds had foretold the rain that would make his trek into a miserable slog. But Helena had made a batch of her special mead and offered to share it, and that desire for a woman's company, which he had felt so often but never fully pursued, enticed him to stay. Her golden curls, and the way the sunlight glinted in her blue-green eyes, the graceful sway of her hips as she danced with him before the Lord's retinue of musicians on the green, those had convinced him to ignore the warnings that nature had given him. And now he was paying the price in this miserable climb, and without even a kiss to show for it. But there was the promise of that to come, the bright side of his mind reminded him. She had asked him to call on her when next he came down. Later as not now, he replied to that voice, and growled inwardly to shut it up. It mostly did. All the same, the memories of his hand on her hips as they danced, and her hands on his shoulders, and the gay smile on her face as he spun her remained, and somehow that created an inner warmth that fought against the chill that threatened from outside. But only a little. Another flash of lightning, followed quickly by a sharp crackle of thunder, brought his eyes up from the nearly invisible track in front of his feet, and in the brief illumination he saw the bend to the right, directly ahead. Just a few tens of yards now and he'd be home. So close. He redoubled his efforts, lengthening his stride and drawing quick breaths as he felt his heart beat faster in time with the exertion. Or was it from the memory of Helena? He shook himself again to force the daydream, the dusk dream, away, and just then another flash of lightning came, brighter than the others, so bright he was left dazzled for a second. The thunder came almost instantly after, so loud he stumbled backward and to the right. He lost his footing and pinwheeled his arms, but failed to right himself, and he found himself sprawled on his right side, his fall cushioned by the soft, slimy embrace of the mud. He lay there for a moment that stretched into a small eternity, stunned by the brilliance of the flash and the impact of the sound, and tasted mud, felt the streaming water running down the hill flow past his body, and through his hair, and down his shirt, filling his boots. And with it the chill of night that would be nearly full if he could see anything besides the purple-yellow afterglow of the lightning strike. His mind shrieked at him to move, to get up and get to his cabin, so close now. But he could not move. He just lay there, blinking away the afterglow, and wondering when it had faded, but somehow still remained, in a yellow-orange flickering that ebbed and flowed over him. It took a minute, then he realized he wasn't imagining that flickering. It was real, and not merely the remnants of the lightning bolt in his eyes, coming from off to the left, nearby. Norman boosted himself up onto his hands and knees and turned his head and felt his mouth drop open. At the bend of the track to his cabin had stood, for as long as he could remember, a stout oak, older than his grandfather, with limbs stretching higher into the heavens than any other tree for miles that he had ever seen. He had played in that oak as a boy, climbing and exploring its limbs and knots, its twisting and growing. Now the oak was stricken, its trunk split in two, and its branches fallen and shattered. The glow was from flickers of flame that fought against the onslaught of the rainfall to eat at the hewn trunk, reaching upward greedily to consume what it could before it was extinguished. He could smell the smoke easily above the scent of the rain, see clearly the wreckage of the once mighty tree, and he realized that the lightning must have struck it. What else could have made such a sound, caused such a lively flame in the onslaught of water from the heavens? Norman forced himself up to his feet, awestruck as much as he was thankful that he hadn't been closer to the tree than he had been when the lightning struck it. If he had been... He blinked, his train of thought stopping when he saw something else in the light of the quickly quenching flame. There was a figure sprawled on the ground between himself and the once mighty tree. Slender, gracefully curved, naked, with silver hair that covered its head and most of its back. He knew immediately it was a woman. But what sort of woman had hair like that who was less than 60? For surely she could not be that old. The dying fire showed plainly the youthful tint of her skin, and though she was face down on the ground, he knew immediately she would have youthful beauty such as he had never seen before. He took a halting step forward, entranced by her, and then he stopped. Where had she come from? Surely she hadn't been up here. No one was crazy enough to be out on an evening like this. No one but him, and he only because he needed to get back to his house. And even he wasn't out without clothing. Norman licked his lips and hurried to her side, more like stumbled. He squatted down to touch the side of her neck. He felt her blood pulsing through her veins, saw the rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. but even more stunned than he had been. He needed to get her inside, get the fire going in his stove, and get them both warmed up. Then he could figure out who she was and where she came from. He hesitated only a moment in removing his cloak and cringed at the renewed onslaught of rain against his exposed chest and shoulders, his shirt sleeves no proof against nature's assault. But he was soaked already, and anyway home was close at hand, so he stooped again to wrap her in the cloak and slipped his hands beneath her shoulders and knees. Then he tensed to lift. He stopped dead as her head turned, and in the fast-fading light of the nearly dead fire her hair parted, revealing an ear that came to a sharp point instead of a person's normal rounding. What was this creature he had found here? Another flash of lightning and another crack of thunder, and he swallowed the surge of confusion and fear that the unnatural feature sent through him. Get inside. Figure it out after, in the warmth. He exhaled and pushed upward with his legs, lifting her in his arms. Her head lolled back over his right elbow as he straightened, revealing an unconscious face of haunting beauty that put all the women he had ever seen, even Helena, to shame. And he almost forgot what he was doing for a moment. Then the last flickering of the flame that he had been trying to eat what remained of the oak went out, and her features faded into dim grayness. Grayness that would soon become black so deep he would never find his home, even as close as it was now. So he forced himself to turn away from the shattered tree and slogged toward the dark outline of black against near black that was his home. Another bolt of lightning flashed just as he reached his front door. Firelight emanated from the open door of Norman's stove, sending heat and light throughout the confines of his small but comfortable home and warding off the chill and damp of the night outside. The rainfall had slackened, going from a continuous pounding against the roof overhead into a slightly arrhythmic tapping that was almost soothing, at least compared with the earlier onslaught. He sat on one of the two carved oak chairs placed around his room's single table, set between the stove and his door, and cradled a steaming mug of tea in his hands. His wetted clothing hung from hooks on the wall near the stove, so as to use its heat to assist in their drying, and he had donned a fresh tunic and leggings from the two-drawer chest of drawers sitting against the wall over by his bed. Norman distinctly did not look over in that direction. The creature lying beneath the bare fur blanket topping his bed would entrance him if he did so for too long. Instead, he just looked at the flames within the black iron of his stove and inhaled the vapors coming from his mug, occasionally sipping the slightly spicy fluid it contained. Sipped, and thought. The woman, whoever and whatever she was, had been remarkably light in his arms, her figure arousingly wondrous and soft, and try though he might, he could not get his mind off the memory of how she had felt when he had carried her. How she had looked when he slipped her beneath his blankets to get her warm. Not that he had ogled. But not seeing was impossible, just as it was impossible to unsee. She definitely was a woman, with the curves and hips and breasts to prove it, but she was not human. The pointed ears proved it, as did the slightly sharpened teeth that had been revealed when her lips parted slightly as he laid her down in his bed. Not deadly sharp like the teeth of a predator, but more angled and pointed than any man or woman's teeth could be. Part of him wanted to throw her back outside into the rain when he saw those teeth, but the tranquil expression on her sleeping face and the haunting beauty of that face stayed his hand. Unnatural as she was, he could not believe she was evil or unclean in some way. But what was she? A rustling from over to the side now drew his eyes away from the flames in his stove, and he saw one of her arms stretch up from underneath his blanket. A soft moan, not from discomfort, but the sort of moan a person makes when she is stretching out of a good sleep, issued from the strange woman. Norman fought back the impulse to rise and move to her side. Whoever she was, whatever she was, finding a stranger's face, looking down on her as the first thing she saw when she woke, would not be a pleasant thing. Besides, maybe he was wrong about her nature. If so, having some distance between her and him would not be imprudent. The moan faded into a sigh that spoke of contented relaxation that, a gasp and a little squeak, and then the woman sat bolt upright. Norman's blanket fell off her, and the gray pink of her nipples seemed to glow in the firelight, drawing his eyes. But the swift movement of her head back and forth, the darting of her eyes, and the expression of confusion bordering on fright, forced his eyes away from that intensing sight, even if propriety hadn't screamed at him to do the same. The woman's eyes alighted upon him, and they grew large. He could see green and blue, with yellow flecks scattered about in her irises, even as she backed away as far as she could, pressing her back up against the cabin's wall, where his bed stood against it. "Be calm," Norman said, holding his open hand toward her and putting on a smile that he hoped was comforting, even as he worked hard to not look down from her face to her bare torso. "I mean you no harm." She gave a shake of her head, and the silver-gray locks flowing past her face seemed to sway. She opened her mouth to speak, but what emerged was not any tongue that Norman knew or had ever heard of. Her voice was deep, almost as deep as his, and seemed to carry a harmony of 3 or 4 notes at once as she made words, but words that were a song more than a spoken language. He felt his mouth drop open from astonishment, but also from the beauty of it. It was language, he knew that. She was speaking. There was meaning there. And he felt like he could just grasp the edge of it. But then it slipped away, and then there was only music, and the emotion that music carried. Confusion and caution, but also wonder and patience that could outweigh mountains, even as it rested in a joy that could not be contained, even if it also felt fear. Norman found himself entranced and had to give himself a shake to pull himself out of it, though perhaps it was merely that she had stopped saying whatever it was she had wanted to say. He placed his mug down atop the table and spread his hands. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." She cocked her head to the side and narrowed her eyes slightly, but didn't speak again. She just looked at him with a stare that was unnerving, as much for its unwavering directness as from her apparent lack of care over her state of undress. He smiled and rose slowly, gesturing toward his stove, atop which sat his other mug, which he had placed there earlier to keep warm in case she woke. Moving with careful slowness, he stepped over to the stove and picked up the mug, then approached her. She kept on watching him with that same unnerving stare, and it was only when he reached the edge of the bed that he registered the true reason it was so disquieting. She had not even blinked once. Swallowing, Norman held the mug out to her and tried not to look like he was as unnerved as he was beginning to feel, whatever the allure of her physicality might be. The strange woman raised her hand slowly and touched the mug, lingering for a long moment as though tasting its warmth. Then she accepted it, cupping the mug in both hands, as he had been doing the moment before she woke. Norman backed away, returning to his chair and then lifting up his own mug and taking a drink to show that it was not dangerous. She watched, still unblinking, and then after a few seconds slowly raised her own mug and took a sip. Her eyes widened slightly as the tea crossed her lips, and then she drank deeply. When she finally lowered her mug, her lips were turned upward into a slight smile. She spoke again, and again it was a harmony of multiple notes that could not have been uttered at once by a single mouth, and yet it was. And again he did not understand the words, though the emotion came through quite clearly. Unexpected pleasure and thankfulness for that. She stopped speaking, and Norman shrugged in response and flashed another smile at her. A pop from the stove drew his eyes away, and he saw a half-dozen embers rising on the air before the open door of the stove, where the fuel within had spat them out. He chuckled slightly. Any other night that pop might have been alarming, but after the lightning strike earlier, the chuckle became deeper, and he turned back to the woman, only to find she had laid back down again. She was resting on her right side, the blanket still carelessly lying so it covered her hips and legs but not her torso, and her arms were curled up around herself to make a natural pillow for her head, and never mind that he had a pillow on his bed already. Her eyes were closed again, and her chest rose and fell slowly. A soft, almost purring came from her. Was she back asleep again already, and so easily, after having been obviously startled and out of sorts just moments ago? But after another several minutes of watching her, and her not moving at all except to breathe, Norman decided that it was true, strange as it might seem. He also realized that he was drowsy as well. Not that he had any place to lay his head, drowsy or no. His was the only bed, and though it was large enough to take two, he wasn't going to presume to join her beneath the blankets there. So he sat up, thinking and sipping at his tea and watching the flames in the stove, and her in equal measure. The growing warmth in the cabin from the stove's heat combined with her near purr to make his eyelids heavy, though, and at some point he felt himself drifting off, his head coming to rest on his forearm atop the table in front of his chair. Norman dreamed, but it was unlike any dream he had ever had. All feelings and tastes and scents, but no images, rumblings, but no distinctive sound. He had the notion of countless years passing, and yet a feeling that time did not exist at all, just a stretching and growth, and reaching and climbing and digging deeper, a tasting that shifted from sweet to slightly sour to full-on tart back to sweet, and a warming that made his limbs stretch further than they ever had, along with a chill that felt almost as though his fingers and toes were painlessly falling off even when they still remained, and he still felt them as normal as they had ever been. Alongside all that, throughout it all, there was a sense of presence, of otherness, that was also oneness, another being beside and within him that cared for and comforted him, protected but also fed off him, played and caressed him but also morphed him into something pleasing to that other presence. All these feelings morphing into one in a slumber that felt like it stretched for eons. But when he opened his eyes, the fire within his stove was still burning, though only tiny flickers of flame amidst the red glow of still warm coals. Norman pushed himself upright and moved to stand in the dim light, but stopped when he looked to the right, toward his bed and the strange woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly and so weirdly. The bare fur blanket was cast aside. She was gone. Norman did a full turn, scanning the entirety of his small one-room home, and found he was completely alone. Only the disturbing of his blanket revealed that the woman had ever been there. But had she been? Maybe he had imagined it. He had dreamed deeply. Maybe she had been part of his dream all along if... A sound interjected itself into his consciousness, and Norman realized it had been there the whole time, just so subtle that he had missed it in his surprise at finding the woman gone. A lilting harmony of notes that flowed together, carrying a tone of sorrow and loss that wrenched at Norman's heart in a way that he could not recall from before. It was coming from outside in the woods beyond his door. Before he even thought about doing it, he had the door open and he stepped outside. It was chilly, so that his breath misted in front of his face. After the stove-generated warmth of his cabin, it was like jumping into a frozen lake. The shock of it was so great. At least it wasn't raining anymore, but still Norman turned around to go back inside. But the harmony was louder now, coming from off to his right, and over in that direction there was a green-yellow glow of some kind that seemed to pulse in time with the harmony's rise and fall. It was not the sun. Through a break in the trees overhead, Norman could see stars. The rains had ended and the clouds were dispersed, but dawn was still far off. Whatever the glow was, it was off toward the bend in the path going down to the village and the Lord's manor, by the old oak. Norman didn't notice the chill of the mud between his bare toes as he moved in that direction, entranced as he was by the music and the radiance both. As he drew near, both resolved themselves before him, and he realized both contained deeper resonances than he had initially perceived. Whereas when the woman had spoken before in his house, it sounded like 3 or 4 notes in harmony together. Now there were 6 or 7. And the glow wasn't just green flashing to yellow, it was a mix of both, twining and swirling around each other and creating other lesser tones as they interacted and played with one another. Norman stopped a dozen or so paces from where the oak stood, awe making him unable to approach any closer, for now he could see that the woman and the tree both were the source of light and sound. She was circling the tree, her outstretched fingers tracing along its bark and roving the wound that the lightning strike had made in the great tree's trunk. Tears of silver were running down her flawless face as she surveyed the damage, and it was like the oak was weeping as well. For was Norman seeing things, or was the sap running freely? Light shone from the woman's skin, yellow to match the green glow that seemed to emanate from the great tree's wound, the source of the twining glow that had drawn Norman there. Her walking around the trunk the cause of the swirling. She came to a halt with her back to him and placed both hands against the stricken tree's trunk, fingers splayed wide, as she bowed her head toward the wound like she was going to kiss it. "What in God's name?" Norman said under his breath, and immediately there was a discordant note to the harmony that had been emanating from the tree and the woman. She stopped and turned, looking at Norman with eyes wide and red from tears. Silver streaked her flawless cheeks, ran down her neck to her chest, and streaked her breasts. It should have marred her beauty, alienated her allure, but instead he found himself drawn to her all the more. But this time, there wasn't any force pushing him, forced propriety making him look away from the lushness of her body. Now there was invitation, to draw near, to enter in, to merge. Norman blinked and shook his head. What was... The harmony shifted as though in response to his question, and he perceived the truth of who she was, and what she was. She and the tree were one, but when the tree was struck, she was struck, thrown from her home and into his. The oak was dying, and if it died, she would as well. But it could still be saved, maybe, with enough love, enough strength of heart combined with faith. She could do it. Maybe. Or maybe the attempt would kill the tree all the sooner, and her with it. But if he assisted... Norman shook his head as the invitation came again, to draw near, to enter in, to merge. What will that do to me, he found himself saying. As if in answer, the harmony shifted again, and he found himself reverting back to his dream. He now knew he had experienced the life of that tree, endless centuries of growth and pleasure and pain that wasn't, stretching and being, and not just the being of that one tree. Norman's mind opened to the deeper truths of that dream, and he realized he was experiencing all the being of the tree that had come before this one, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the certainty that he would experience the trees to come after this one as its acorns grew and grew. An expanding and constantly growing experience that would not stop until the world ended or the last of the tree's descendants was torn down and burned. Norman was moving forward before he even realized he had done it, found himself standing before the lovely alien beauty who had come so unexpectedly and weirdly into his life. She smiled up at him, a sensuous smile that offered welcome and oneness and merging and pleasures that he couldn't imagine, offerings beyond anything a mere mortal woman like Helena could offer. And the offer would be ongoing as long as the tree and its descendants stood. Oneness, entrance into her core, offspring from their union, and awareness eternal or near enough to it. As his lips touched hers, he felt her tongue probing against his, and he felt the sharpness of her teeth, and then a flash of alarm. He tried to pull back, but arms that were suddenly rough, bark-like, wrapped around him with an impeccable strength that could burrow through granite in its probing for water, deep in the soil. Strength that could withstand the strongest winds. How could he fight against that? He could not. He felt himself being wrapped around, enclosed in wood. He tried to move, but could not. He opened his mouth to scream, and roots plunged within him and down his throat. And then there was pain, followed by blackness. 2 weeks later, a patrol of the Lord's militia came up to Norman's cabin. They found the door ajar and the stove long cold, but no sign of him. Puzzled, they descended to the village to report his disappearance. They never noticed the oak at the bend of the path, how its trunk was twisted as though twined around itself, or how the bubbling of the trunk in one spot resembled a man's face, locked into an eternal scream of terror, or the other section higher up that almost looked like a woman's face with a look of satisfaction upon it. Okay, so I guess the question is, did our man really get the semi-immortal life going forward as part of the tree and enjoying it into the future as promised? Or did he get all gobbled up and was he the sacrifice that healed the tree and let the Dryad return home? Are they really joined together and having fun? Or not? Tough to say. I'm not sure. I would say read and find out, but I haven't written anything after this particular story with this particular character. Not sure how I would. So I'll leave it to you to decide. So I liked that one. It's kind of fun. Enjoyed writing it. I don't remember if there was anything particularly that prompted me to write it. It was just my weekly story that I needed to do. I don't remember if I was submitting it to something or not. Regardless, it turned out pretty well, I think. Let me know what you think. We got comments, we got Twitter, we got the email, contact forms on the webpage. You can tell me what you think to your heart's delight. I assume that you liked, even if you didn't like this particular story, which I must be honest, you liked it. But even if you didn't, since you're here, you're probably liking the other stories I wrote, which means you should go buy books, not just Glimmervale, the book I pimped at the beginning of this show. Although that would be a good one to get because it's, start of a soon-to-be 7-volume series. The 7th volume is getting out to Kickstarter backers and other people here in the next month or two. But, so that's a good series to get into. But, there's a bunch of other books. You can see 4 of them around the corners of my thing here. But, there's a whole lot more besides that. So you should go to michaelkingswood.com/store. And you should pick up a few books. Get all you want. We are more than happy to ship out as many as you order. Whether they're print or ebook or audiobook. We can do it all. For those of them that have had the audiobooks created, that is, of course. that said, it's best to go through me because I get more money that way. I don't have the middleman. But if you like going through Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Kobo and Google Play and iBooks and all the other places, you can. My books are everywhere. Go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read the number 2, and you will get links to wherever, every place you can possibly find my stories that you could want. Go to them. That's fine by me. Other ways you can support, of course, if you haven't liked and subscribed with this channel, whether it's the video channel, the podcast channel, or both, make sure you've done that. Make sure you're telling all your friends that you've done that. And go by the Subscribe Star page, michaelkingswood.com/subscribe. I really should make that simple link, because that pretty link for it, since it makes it easier for me to remember. But it's not, for right now, the link is still subscribestar.com/michael-kingswood. Again, it's relatively new. Not a lot going on there. Want to have a lot going on there, so get over there, help your brother out. Give a couple bucks a month to help keep the lights on and the story reading going. And we will be back next week with more stories. We're getting into Volume 2 now of last year's project. Volume 2 contained 10 stories. The first one is called The Walker's Package. And this is getting into modern fantasy stuff, getting into an adventure of one of my favorite characters, Dustin Cofield, Elf Sterminator. What's an Elf Sterminator, do you say? Well, you should come back next week and find out. It's kind of fun. These are fun stories. You'll like it. And I enjoy writing them. Gonna write a lot more of them. Gonna read a lot more of them, too. We'll do that next week. I'll talk to you then. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.